Millionaire takes his new girlfriend to fly in his private jet, but freezes upon recognizing the flight attendant. It was his ex. What he didn't expect was that a secret, kept by her for years, would shock him and change his life forever. The crisp air of New York City, thin in the circles of power that Richard Harrington inhabited, always carried the metallic scent of money and ambition. For Richard, a titan of the real estate market whose signature turned vacant lots into gleaming skyscrapers, life was a series of calculated conquests. He didn't just build buildings, he built an image, a fortress of unshakable success, where every brick was a trophy and every window reflected his own ego. At 42, he had mastered the art of turning everything into an asset, including people. And it was with that predatory mindset that his eyes landed on Victoria during a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum. She was a spectacle of youth and beauty, with a smile designed for the society pages and an almost tangible admiration for the power he exuded. To Richard, she wasn't a person but an accessory, the next luxury item to acquire and display. The invitation, therefore, was a formality, a masterstroke on his personal chessboard. "How about a weekend in Aspen? I have an incredible place there. We'll fly in my jet, of course." The phrase was uttered with the casualness of offering coffee, but it carried the weight of a power play. It was his method: accelerate the conquest through ostentation, creating a debt of gratitude and awe that put him in control from the first moment. The private hangar at Teterboro Airport was a sanctuary for Richard's ego. The Gulfstream G280, with its sleek lines and the discreet monogram of Harrington Enterprises on the tail, was more than transportation. It was a winged throne. As they boarded, the smell of new leather and polished wood enveloped them. Victoria sighed, her eyes scanning every detail of the luxurious cabin, from the ice-white leather seats to the brushed metal accents. She settled in with the grace of someone who had rehearsed the role, adjusting her silk dress and accepting the waiting flute of champagne. Richard watched the scene with a satisfied smile. Everything was going according to script. He sat across from her, loosening his tie, the king in his mobile castle. The pilot, a middle-aged man with an impassive face, finished preparations in the cockpit, his voice a technical murmur in the distance. Then the cabin door opened again, and a figure appeared, moving with silent efficiency that contrasted with Victoria's dazzlement. It was the flight attendant, and in the instant Richard saw her, the carefully constructed world around him began to crumble. The air seemed to thicken heavy. The champagne in his hand lost its sparkle. It was Isabella. The name echoed in his mind like distant thunder, bringing with it the storm of a past he had sealed in a vault and thrown into the sea. 5 years. 5 years since he had abandoned her with the cowardice of a note and the coldness of a blocked phone number. She was there, dressed in an impeccable navy uniform, her hair pulled into a perfect bun, subtle makeup enhancing the same beauty that had once enchanted him. But something was different. The sweetness in her eyes had been replaced by a layer of ice, a professional serenity sharper than any accusation. His heart, a muscle he believed he had trained for indifference, raced, hammering against his ribs with forgotten violence. Isabella walked through the cabin, her eyes passing over him as if he were just another anonymous passenger, a piece of furniture. "Mr. Harrington, ma'am, welcome aboard. My name is Isabella and I'll be at your service during the flight. Please fasten your seatbelts for takeoff." Her voice was the same, but the tone was different. It was polished, distant, devoid of any emotion, as if they had never shared secrets under the starry sky of Malibu, as if he had never promised her a future that he himself destroyed. Richard felt his blood run cold. A coincidence? Impossible. The universe wasn't that cruelly ironic. He operated an exclusive fleet with a fixed crew. How was she there? He tried to compose himself, forcing a smile for Victoria, who, oblivious to the emotional tsunami engulfing him, pointed at the window, marveling at the view of other jets on the tarmac. "This is incredible, Richard. I'll never get used to this." Her voice was an irritating noise, an unwanted distraction amid the chaos in his mind. He just nodded, his throat too dry to form a response. The pilot announced takeoff, and the jet began to accelerate, pressing him against the leather seat. As the aircraft climbed, tearing through the grey clouds of New York, Richard felt his world plummeting in freefall. He poured himself more champagne, the bubbling liquid sliding down his throat without any taste. His eyes, however, were fixed on Isabella. He watched her circulate the cabin, checking compartments, adjusting a curtain, moving with a grace and professionalism that disarmed him. Every gesture was torture. The way she tilted her head, the way her long, slender fingers held the tray, it all brought back a flood of memories he had worked so hard to bury. He remembered their discussions about the future, the panic he felt when she talked about marriage, kids, building something real. He remembered the cold, calculated decision to cut ties, to disappear to preserve his precious freedom, his armor against vulnerability. And now the ghost of that decision haunted him at 30,000 feet, serving him champagne with an impenetrable smile. He needed to understand. He needed an explanation. But how? Victoria was there, a smiling, chattering obstacle. He tried to catch Isabella's eye, searching for any crack in her armor, any sign of recognition, anger, pain. But there was nothing. Just a polished void, a professional indifference that left him completely disoriented. He felt like a stranger in his own jet, a prisoner in his gilded cage. The flight, meant to be a demonstration of his power and control, had turned into a stage for his own impotence. Every minute was agony. The hum of the engines seemed to amplify the deafening silence between him and the woman he had once loved and discarded. He looked at Victoria, now flipping through a fashion magazine, completely absorbed in a world of superficial luxury he had introduced her to. She was the present he had chosen, uncomplicated, without history, without depth, and Isabella was the past returning to collect the bill, a past that, he was beginning to suspect, carried consequences far deeper than he could have ever imagined. The champagne wasn't helping anymore. In fact, it only intensified the sense of unreality, of being trapped in a lucid nightmare. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes, but her image persisted, etched on his eyelids. The cold, distant flight attendant, a spectre of his own moral failure, navigating calmly through the turbulence she had somehow created in his life. And worst of all was the question burning in his mind, one for which he had no answer. What did she want? Revenge? Money? Or something much, much worse? The time aboard the Gulfstream seemed distorted, each second stretching into a tense eternity. Richard tried to maintain the facade of the perfect host, engaging in superficial conversation with Victoria about the ski slopes they planned to visit and the Michelin-starred restaurants he had already reserved. But his words sounded hollow, mechanical, as if spoken by an automaton. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in Isabella's orbit. He watched her with the intensity of a predator suddenly discovering itself as prey, analyzing every movement for a clue, a slip. But she was the embodiment of composure. When she served the nuts and dried fruits, her fingers didn't tremble. When she offered another flute of champagne, her smile didn't waver. It was that serenity, that almost supernatural calm, that disturbed him most. It wasn't the reaction of a woman reuniting with the man who broke her heart. It was the calm of someone who held absolute control of the situation, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Richard, a man who built his empire on reading people and anticipating moves, felt completely blind, groping in the dark of a game whose rules he didn't know. The anxiety grew in his chest like a poisonous vine, slowly suffocating him. He needed air, an escape route, but he was confined in that luxury capsule at 30,000 feet, with his past and present seated just meters away. It was then that the soft hiss of the internal communication system broke the flight's monotony, and the pilot's voice, until then a distant murmur, filled the cabin with alarming clarity. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. I apologize for the interruption, but our instruments indicate an irregular fluctuation in the secondary hydraulic system. While it doesn't pose an immediate risk, safety protocol is unequivocal. To ensure everyone's total safety, we'll make an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport equipped to handle us. We're initiating descent procedures for the regional airport in Vale in the Rockies." The words fell on Richard like a sentence. Vale? Not Aspen? Initial frustration quickly gave way to fury. He, Richard Harrington, was not a man of unforeseen events. His life was a symphony of impeccable logistics. "Unacceptable," he growled, more to himself than to the others, unbuckling his belt as if he were about to stand and march to the cockpit to fix the issue personally. "Call my team. I want a helicopter waiting in Vale as soon as we land. I'm not getting stuck in some provincial airport." His eyes sought Isabella, expecting to see a hint of concern, apologies, anything to validate his indignation. But what he found was an ocean of calm. She approached, her expression serene, almost apathetic. "Mr. Harrington, please return to your seat and fasten your belt. Safety is our priority. The captain is already in contact with ground teams. All arrangements will be made once we land." Her coldness was a bucket of ice water on his incandescent rage. She wasn't surprised, she wasn't nervous, and in that instant, a terrible suspicion, still formless, began to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't chance. Her presence, the technical failure, the diversion to a secondary town. The pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to assemble were starting to fit. The jet descended smoothly, cutting through the blue sky and revealing the rugged, verdant landscape of the Rocky Mountains. The pines rose like ancient sentinels, and the scenery, which should have been a delight to the eyes, now seemed sinister, part of a well-laid trap. The landing was perfect, a display of technical skill that contrasted with the supposed mechanical failure. As the wheels touched the asphalt, the roar of the engines faded, replaced by a heavy silence broken only by the expensive tick of Richard's watch. Victoria, who had gone pale during the announcement, now seemed to recover. What a scare! But what an adventure, right? At least we're safe. Her attempt at lightness sounded absurdly out of place. Richard didn't respond. He watched through the window as the stairs were attached to the aircraft door. The air that entered when the door opened was cold and pure, laden with the scent of pine and damp earth, a brutal contrast to the artificial controlled air of the cabin and his life in New York. On the concrete apron, under the mild afternoon sun, a solitary figure awaited them. It was an older man with grey hair and an erect posture, wearing a worn leather jacket over a plaid shirt. There was a quiet dignity in his demeanor, and his eyes, a surprisingly vivid blue, seemed to assess the jet and its occupants with calm curiosity. Isabella was the first to descend, and the interaction between her and the man was subtle but revealing. A slight nod, a glance that exchanged volumes of information in a single second. Richard descended next, with Victoria on his heels, and the man approached, his walk slow but firm. "Welcome to Vale even under unexpected circumstances," he said, his voice a deep, welcoming baritone. "My name is Harold. I'm Isabella's grandfather." He extended his hand to Richard, and the grip was firm, the hand calloused from manual work. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. The grandfather. The web was closing. "The mechanic's been notified, but the part needed for the hydraulic system repair won't arrive from Denver until tomorrow morning. Sorry for the inconvenience." "Inconvenience is an understatement," Richard retorted. Arrogance his only defense against the growing sense of vulnerability. "As I said, I've already requested a helicopter. We don't intend to stay." It was then that Victoria intervened, with a smile that seemed to Richard for the first time a bit forced. "Oh, Richard, don't be so hasty. Where's your sense of adventure? Look at this place, it's beautiful, and Mr. Harold was so kind." She turned to the older man. "You said your granddaughter is a flight attendant. What a coincidence she was on this flight." The phrase was said with such exaggerated innocence that it sounded like a poorly rehearsed cue. Harold smiled, a smile that didn't reach his piercing eyes. "Coincidences. Life in the mountains teaches us they rarely exist. But since you're stuck here until tomorrow, I can't leave you without accommodations. Our family has a small lodge nearby. It's simple, but comfortable. I insist you be my guests." The offer was made as a courtesy, but it sounded like a summons. Richard looked from Harold to Isabella, who remained silent, an impassive observer. He looked at Victoria, whose enthusiasm seemed increasingly fake. Everyone there seemed to share a secret, a script of which he was the only one without a copy. He was cornered. Refusing the offer would be a rudeness even he wouldn't allow in public, and the truth was that the idea of waiting hours in a tiny airport lobby was even less appealing. "I appreciate the kindness," he conceded, the words gritted through his teeth. "It'll be just for one night." Harold smiled again, and this time there was a glint of triumph in his eyes. Of course, just one night. As he followed the man toward an old pickup truck parked near the hangar, Richard felt the chill of the mountains penetrate his bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the premonition that this night would be the longest and most transformative of his life. The drive from the small airport to the lodge was a blur of green and silence. Richard squeezed in the pickup's cab between a stoic Harold at the wheel and a Victoria who now seemed to have exhausted her repertoire of enchanted exclamations, felt increasingly out of place. Isabella followed behind in her own car, a ghostly presence in the rearview mirror. The lodge, called Rocky Pines Retreat, emerged at the end of a dirt road flanked by aspens. It was a structure of wood and stone, with wide porches and a steep roof that gave it an alpine chalet air. It was charming, rustic, and to Richard claustrophobic. It represented everything he wasn't, simple, organic, without the polished ostentation of concrete and glass. "This is it," Harold announced, parking the vehicle. "Make yourselves at home." The expression was an invitation, but to Richard it sounded like the start of a sentence. He got out of the pickup, the mountain air enveloping him, dense and scented. Isabella was already waiting at the entrance, keys to the rooms in hand, her flight attendant efficiency transposed to the role of reluctant hostess. "I'll show you your rooms," she said, her voice neutral, avoiding his gaze. "Dinner will be served at 8. The interior of the lodge was even more welcoming, and for that reason more oppressive to Richard. The dark wood creaked under his Italian shoes. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and the smell of burning wood mingled with fresh coffee. There was a silence there, a peace he didn't know, and that, in his internal agitation, seemed an affront. They followed Isabella down a hallway of wide planks, decorated with black and white photographs of mountain landscapes and old airplanes, biplanes and prop planes that seemed from another era. It was in that hallway that time stopped. Sitting on the wooden floor, his back to them, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 4 or 5, and was completely absorbed in his own world. A miniature universe spread around him. They were airplanes, dozens of small metal and plastic planes organized in a complex formation on the floor. The boy made engine sounds with his mouth, a low, concentrated hum as he moved a small silver jet in a graceful arc, simulating a landing. Richard stopped abruptly, a step behind Isabella. There was something in the concentration of that small figure, in the seriousness with which he treated his play, that held him. Victoria, noticing the pause, whispered, "How cute. Some guest's son." Isabella didn't respond to her. Her body stiffened for a moment and then, with a deep breath that Richard could almost feel, she turned. "Lucas," she called, her voice soft but firm. The boy, hearing the call, interrupted his imaginary flight and turned, and Richard Harrington's universe imploded. The face that rose to meet them was a mirror, a miniature and eerily perfect version of himself. The same brown eyes, large and inquisitive, that he saw every morning in the mirror. The same jaw shape, the same stubborn curve of the mouth. Even the way the left eyebrow arched slightly in curiosity was a carbon copy of his own mannerism. The air fled his lungs. The hallway seemed to tilt, the wooden walls closing in on him. The hum of the boy's planes was replaced by a high-pitched ringing in his own ears. He looked at Isabella, a million questions dying on his lips, his mind unable to process the scene. The silence that settled was dense, heavy, laden with 5 years of unspoken words and an undeniable truth. It was Isabella who broke it. She placed her hand gently on the boy's shoulder, and with her eyes fixed on Richard's in a cold, direct challenge, she uttered the words that would seal his fate. "This is Lucas, my son." The revelation wasn't a whisper, it was an explosion. Richard felt the ground vanish, the wooden hallway turning into a bottomless abyss. "Your son?" he managed to stammer, his voice an unrecognizable thread. He looked at the boy, who now stared at him with innocent curiosity, oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated. The boy smiled, a smile that was familiar. "Do you like airplanes too?" asked Lucas, his childish voice clear and cutting through the tension like a blade. He held up the silver jet. "This is a Gulfstream, like the one that landed today. Grandpa showed me." Richard couldn't respond. His mind was a whirlwind of denial, fury, and a primordial terror he had never felt. Victoria, at his side, finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of the situation. Her mouth opened and closed without sound, her eyes wide, darting from Richard to the boy and back to Isabella, the facade of her surprise finally crumbling into genuine shock. Isabella, however, remained unshakable. "Your room is the last on the right, Richard. Yours is the one across, Victoria. Dinner, as I said, is at 8. With that, she took Lucas's hand and guided him in the opposite direction, leaving Richard paralyzed in the hallway, a man who built empires now reduced to ruins by a 5-year-old child and a handful of toy planes. Dinner was a masterpiece of psychological torture. The table, set in the main room in front of the crackling fireplace, was a silent battlefield. On one side, Richard, tense as a steel cable, barely touching his food. Beside him, Victoria, now quiet and observant, her role as conquest forgotten. On the other side, Isabella with glacial calm, and Harold, whose presence was a mix of hospitality and vigilance. And at the center of it all, the epicenter of the earthquake, was Lucas. The boy, seated in a booster chair next to his mother, was the only source of life and innocence at that table laden with ghosts. He talked non-stop, his childish excitement a surreal counterpoint to the adult's tension. And his topic was one: airplanes. "Grandpa, do you think one day I'll get to fly a 747? Have you flown one? Was it hard? How many engines does it have?" Harold answered each question with infinite patience, his eyes shining with pride. "Of course you will, champ. If you study hard. I've flown plenty of them. It's not hard when you love what you do." The conversation was a duet between grandfather and grandson, but each word was a poisoned arrow for Richard. He heard about the boy's passion for aerodynamics, how he already knew the difference between an Airbus and a Boeing, about his dream of being a pilot, just like Grandpa was. Then, in a moment that made Richard's heart stop, Lucas turned to him, his big brown eyes fixed on his. "My dad travels the world by plane too," he said with proud conviction. "That's why he can't come visit. He's a pilot on international flights. Mom told me." The lie. The pious and devastating lie that Isabella had built to protect her son from the truth about the father who abandoned him before even knowing of his existence. The simplicity with which the boy uttered those words, the unwavering faith in a heroic, absent father, cut Richard deeper than any accusation, any shout of anger could have. He tasted the bitter bile in his throat. He wasn't a hero. He was the villain in that story, a villain so cowardly that he hadn't even had the courage to face the consequences of his actions, forcing the woman he destroyed to invent a fantasy to fill the void he left. In that instant, under his son's innocent gaze, Richard Harrington felt, for the first time in his life, truly poor. The air in the lodge's dining room was as thin as at the top of one of Richard's skyscrapers, but instead of power, it was saturated with unbearable tension. Each forkful was a Herculean effort, each sip of wine a pretext to avoid eye contact. Lucas's revelation about his hero dad hung over the table like a storm cloud, charged with electricity. Richard felt the stares on him, Isabella's cold and appraising, Harold's a mix of pity and contempt, and Victoria's, now clearly uncomfortable, an actress whose role had ended abruptly mid-play. He wanted to scream, break something, explode in a fury that might somehow mask the shame corroding him from within. But he was paralyzed, silenced by the purity of the lie his son believed, the lie that he, with his cowardice, had made necessary. He was a ghost at that table, an absence that paradoxically was the strongest and most disturbing presence of all. The crackle of the wood in the fireplace was the only sound daring to fill the silence, a rhythmic accompaniment to the silent disintegration of a man. It was in that moment of silent climax that the lodge's front door opened, bringing with it a gust of the cold night air and a new character to that infernal stage. The figure who entered was elegant, imposing, dressed in a beige cashmere coat that cost more than many people's annual salary. Her silver hair was cut in an impeccable style, and her eyes, the same brown as Richard's and Lucas's, swept the room with natural authority. It was Margaret Harrington, the matriarch, the only person in the world whose power and influence rivaled Richard's. The surprise on his face was instantaneous, an electric shock that made him straighten in his chair. "Mother, what are you doing here?" The question came out harsh, laden with a rapidly forming suspicion. Margaret didn't respond to him immediately. Her eyes landed first on Lucas, and a genuine smile, something Richard rarely saw, softened her features. "Hello, my dear," she said to the boy, who looked at her with curiosity. Then she turned to the rest of the table, her gaze passing over Isabella and Harold with a nod of recognition, and over Victoria with polite coldness, before finally fixing on her son. "I came to make sure you wouldn't run this time, Richard." The phrase was said in a low, almost conversational tone, but it carried the weight of an anvil. And with it, the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place in Richard's mind, revealing the complete and terrifying image of the conspiracy. It wasn't just Isabella, it wasn't a coincidence, it was a plan, an orchestrated plan, and the conductor was there, standing before him. The fury, previously contained, exploded. "You," he hissed, rising from the table with the abrupt movement that made the chair scrape noisily on the wooden floor. "This was all you, the flight, the technical failure, her." He pointed at Victoria, who shrank under his accusatory gaze. "And her." His finger then moved to Isabella, who held his gaze without flinching. "It was all your plan." Margaret walked slowly to the table, her calm a stark contrast to Richard's fury. She didn't deny it. On the contrary, she confirmed each suspicion with frightening tranquility. "Yes, Richard, it was me. I hired Miss Anderson," she said, referring to Victoria with a formality that stripped her of any intimacy. "An excellent private investigator, by the way, to get close to you. I arranged for Isabella, whom I located over a year ago, to be on that flight. And yes, I spoke with the pilot and her grandfather to ensure this unforeseen happened. I needed you to stop running." Each word was a blow. His own mother, the woman who raised him, who supported him in every venture, had set up an elaborate trap, manipulating his life, his relationships, everything to corner him. The betrayal was so deep, so personal, that it left him breathless. "Why?" he managed to ask, his voice choked with rage and pain. "Why do this?" Margaret stopped in front of him, the table between them, and for the first time Richard saw not the ruthless businesswoman, but a mother with a heavy heart. "Because I couldn't let you turn completely into your father," she said, her voice now laden with ancient sadness. "I watched your father make the same mistakes, Richard. Running from emotional responsibilities, building walls around his heart, leaving a trail of broken lives in the name of ambition. He died a rich and powerful man, but he died alone. I refused to watch my only son follow the same path to the same lonely abyss." The mention of his father, a man whose memory Richard revered and feared in equal measure, was the final blow. He staggered back, as if physically struck, and sank back into the chair, defeated. The food on his plate now seemed inedible. The wine tasted like ashes. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all, a silence of exposed truths and destroyed defenses. It was Lucas's innocent voice that once again broke the spell. Oblivious to the adult drama unfolding, he had pulled something from his pocket during the confusion. It was a small airplane, roughly carved from wood, but made with evident care. He stood on his chair, stretching across the table to show the toy to Richard, who was still lost in his stupor. "Look," said the boy, with a radiant smile that was a beacon of light in the darkness of that room. "Grandpa helped me make it. It's a biplane. He said the first pilots were the bravest." Richard raised his eyes, focusing with difficulty on the small wooden object and his son's illuminated face. The simplicity of the moment, the purity of the boy's joy, was both torture and blessing. Then Lucas uttered the phrase that would haunt him, the question that would define the rest of his life. He looked directly into Richard's eyes, with all the hope and faith a 5-year-old could muster, and asked, "When I grow up, I want to fly with my dad. Do you think he'll want to fly with me?" The question wasn't asked to the hero pilot of international flights from the bedtime story. It was asked to him, Richard Harrington, the broken and exposed man. And in the silence that followed, as everyone at the table held their breath, Richard realized that the answer to that question wouldn't be given with words, but with the actions he chose to take from that moment on. His son's future and the salvation of his own soul depended on it. The rest of dinner passed like a fever dream. Richard doesn't remember how the meal ended, or how he said goodbye to the others. He moved in a state of shock, an automaton guided by basic instincts. The only thing he registered clearly was the moment Isabella took a sleepy Lucas to bed, the boy rubbing his eyes and mumbling a general good night before disappearing down the hallway. Each step Richard took toward his room was heavy, as if walking on the ocean floor. The room, with its wooden walls, rustic furniture, and an inviting bed, was a cell. He closed the door, and the sound of the latch echoed like a prison gate. Alone. For the first time in that long, torturous night, he was truly alone with his thoughts, and they were cruel company. He didn't turn on the main light, leaving the room plunged in dimness, illuminated only by the silver moonlight entering through the window. He walked to the glass and looked out. The mountain landscape, the dark silhouettes of pines against a star-encrusted sky, was of vast and indifferent beauty. A beauty that didn't care about his concrete empires, his stock trades, his name in the society columns. There, in that quietude, the walls he had built around himself for decades began to crumble, brick by brick. The anger gave way to something much deeper and scarier, an abyssal void. Lucas's question, "Do you think he'll want to fly with me?" echoed in his mind, not as an accusation, but as a lament, and with it came the avalanche. He thought about the last 5 years. While he was closing multi-million-dollar deals, buying new cars, traveling to exotic destinations with a succession of beautiful, forgettable women, a boy who was his blood, his flesh, was learning to walk. The first step. He missed it. He imagined the wobbly little legs, the fall, the cry, the comfort in his mother's arms that weren't his. While he was in conference calls with international investors, his son's first word was spoken. Mommy? Grandpa? Airplane? He'd never know. He missed it. While he celebrated the opening of yet another monumental building with champagne and applause, his son was blowing out the candles on his first, second, third, fourth, fifth birthday. 5 cakes, 5 happy birthday songs, 5 wishes made. And he wasn't in any of them. He missed them all. The dimension of what he had lost hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't money, it wasn't a deal, it wasn't something he could recover with a hostile takeover or a financial maneuver. It was time. It was moments. It was fragments of a life he didn't even know existed, and that now formed a mosaic of absence in his soul. He, Richard Harrington, the master of planning, the man who controlled every variable, had made the most monumental miscalculation of all. He had traded the irreplaceable for the trivial. He stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. His mother's words returned, sharp and precise. "I couldn't let you turn completely into your father." He had always prided himself on being like his father, on inheriting his business acumen, his relentless ambition. But now, for the first time, he saw the other side of that inheritance, the loneliness, the emotional void, the inability to connect. His father had left a legacy of wealth and a trail of destroyed relationships, and he was on the same path. The night dragged on, long and sleepless. Every shadow in the room seemed to take the shape of his failures, every sound outside, the hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind, seemed to mock his self-imposed solitude. He didn't cry. Richard Harrington didn't cry. But something inside him, something he had kept frozen for so long, began to melt painfully. The next morning, while Richard was still lost in his reflections, Victoria was already waiting in the living room, her suitcase ready by the door. Her eyes no longer had the superficial sparkle from the night of the flight, but a cold, resigned clarity. "Margaret already settled what she owed me," she said, her voice emotionless. "I was hired to bring you here, Richard, not to participate in your family drama. My role is over." She looked at him one last time, not with anger, but with a kind of professional pity. "Good luck, you'll need it." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked to the car already waiting outside, disappearing from his life as methodically as she had entered. The sun of the following morning rose pale, filtering through the window and finding Richard in the same position he had spent most of the night, sitting on the bed, eyes open in the darkness. He felt exhausted, as if he had fought a battle all night. He got up, took a cold shower, dressed mechanically. He didn't know what to do, what step to take. The only certainty was that he couldn't run anymore. As he left the room, the smell of coffee and fresh bread guided him to the dining room. Only Harold was there reading a newspaper. He raised his eyes over his glasses when Richard entered and merely nodded, a gesture that was neither friendly nor hostile, just an acknowledgement. Richard poured himself a cup of coffee and was about to sit when a childish voice called from the hallway. "Richard!" It was Lucas. The boy came running toward him, eyes shining with excitement. "Come see! Grandpa gave me a new collection. They're wooden planes from World War II. There's a Spitfire and a Mustang." The invitation was so pure, so devoid of the previous night's tension, that Richard found himself unable to refuse. He followed the boy, who pulled him by the hand with surprising strength, back to the hallway that had been the stage of his ruin, and perhaps his redemption. The floor of Lucas's room was a miniature hangar. Besides the plastic models, there was now a squadron of wooden planes, each with a rustic detailed finish. The boy knelt, picking up one of the planes with reverence. "This is my favorite," he said, handing Richard a fighter model with the insignia of the US Air Force. "Grandpa said American pilots flew these in Europe." Richard held the small wooden plane. It was light, but in his hands it seemed to have the weight of the world. He ran his fingers over the smooth surface, the carefully sanded wings. He looked at the boy before him, at the genuine passion in his eyes, at the trust with which he shared his treasure. And then Lucas looked at him, the same serious and hopeful gaze from the night before, and repeated the phrase that had become the mantra of his newly discovered existence. "When I grow up, I want to fly with my dad." This time the phrase didn't come with the question. It was a statement, a declaration of faith, and it was that which finally broke the dam. Richard felt a knot form in his throat, a pressure in his chest he couldn't contain. His eyes, dry for years of calculated indifference, burned. A tear, hot and solitary, escaped and rolled down his face. Then another, and another. He didn't try to hide them. There, on the floor of his son's room, surrounded by toy planes, Richard Harrington cried. He cried for the lost years, for the unspoken words, for the ungiven hugs. He cried for his father's loneliness and the fear of inheriting the same fate. And for the first time, he realized with blinding clarity that all his skyscrapers, all his millions, all his power, were worth absolutely nothing. They were hollow structures, empty of meaning, compared to the monumental and terrifying task now before him, learning to be a father. Richard's crying wasn't a spectacle of sobs, but a silent collapse. The tears, which he had long considered a sign of weakness, were now a purification, washing away years of arrogance and loneliness. Lucas, with the intuitive wisdom only children possess, didn't get scared. He just observed the big man before him with solemn seriousness. Then, with a simple gesture containing a universe of compassion, the boy took his favorite wooden plane, the biplane, and placed it gently in Richard's hand. "You can keep this one," he whispered, "for good luck." In that instant, Richard knew his life, as he knew it, was over. What would emerge from those ruins he didn't know, but for the first time, he felt the hope of building something that truly mattered. The morning of departure arrived with cruel beauty. The mountain sky was a limpid blue, and the air cold and invigorating. The jet, supposedly repaired, awaited at the small airport, a gleaming metal symbol of the world Richard should reclaim. The suitcases were ready. His mother, Margaret, watched him with a gaze that was a mix of anxiety and hope. Isabella kept a calculated distance, her face an impenetrable mask, though Richard could now detect a sliver of vulnerability in her eyes. The farewell happened on the lodge's patio. The plan was simple. Richard would return to New York, reorganize his life, and begin somehow to build a bridge over the 5-year abyss separating him from his son. It would be a slow, painful process, full of weekend visits and scheduled calls. It was the logical path, the sensible one. But logic had abandoned Richard. While his driver loaded the last suitcase into the car, his eyes were drawn to the lawn beside the lodge. There, Lucas and his grandfather, Harold, were engaged in a sacred ritual. They weren't playing with a toy plane, but assembling a real model airplane, a scale replica of a glider with a wingspan of nearly 6 feet. Richard watched, hypnotized, the interaction between the two. The grandfather's calloused hands guiding the grandson's small ones, adjusting a cable, tightening a screw, explaining in a low voice the principles of lift and air resistance. There was a complicity there, a transfer of knowledge and love as tangible as the wood and fabric of the glider. They weren't just building a plane, they were building memories, a legacy. And Richard was a spectator, a stranger looking into a world he desperately wanted to belong to. "It's time, Richard," said his mother softly. He nodded but didn't move. His feet seemed rooted to the ground. He looked at the distant jet at the airport, then at the glider on the lawn. One represented power, speed, escape. The other represented patience, presence, construction. And in his heart a decision bloomed not unexpectedly, but with the inevitable certainty of a seed finally breaking through the soil. He turned to his mother. "Call the pilot. Tell him to head back to New York." "Alone?" Margaret raised her eyebrows, surprised, but a triumphant smile shone in her eyes. "And the company? The board meeting?" "Let them sell the shares. Let them fire me," Richard replied, and for the first time in his life, the words sounded like freedom, not failure. "I'm going to build something more important here." He walked toward Isabella, who watched him with a mix of shock and distrust. He stopped at a respectful distance. "I know I can't fix the past, Isabella. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm not going to be a weekend dad. I'm staying, I'll learn, even if it's just to be worthy of tying his shoes." She didn't respond, but he saw something in her eyes, a crack in the ice she had built around herself. It wasn't forgiveness nor rekindled love. It was something much more fragile and precious. Possibility. Satisfied with that small glimpse of hope, Richard turned and walked toward the lawn. He didn't run. Each step was deliberate, a commitment. Lucas and Harold saw him approach. The boy stopped what he was doing, his eyes large and questioning. Richard knelt on the damp grass beside Lucas and old Harold, not caring about the designer pants now staining with earth. The boy extended a small screwdriver to him, his eyes shining with expectation. "You tighten this screw, but not too much, or the wing will break," he said with the naturalness of someone sharing a sacred secret. Richard took the tool. In his hands, so accustomed to signing billion-dollar contracts, that simple object seemed to hold the weight of a destiny. He breathed deeply, and for the first time he didn't feel in command. He felt like an apprentice. Isabella watched from afar, arms crossed, her face still protected by an ancient ice. But seeing the once all-powerful businessman bent beside his son, erring, learning, getting his hands dirty, she quickly averted her gaze. And for an instant, Richard noticed the crack in the wall she had built around herself. For an instant, Isabella averted her gaze, as if she needed to blink more times than normal. It was almost imperceptible, but Richard noticed. Behind the ice, there was a silent crack, a remnant of emotion she struggled to hide. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't love reborn. It was something rarer and more fragile, hope. Lucas, radiant, looked at him as if there were no past, as if all the lost years were just a prologue to that instant. "When I grow up, I want to fly with my dad. Will you fly with me?" he asked, repeating the phrase that already echoed in Richard's mind like a sentence. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look away. "I will fly with you, Lucas, and I'll start now." And on that simple mountain lawn, with a glider of wood and fabric in his hands, Richard Harrington, the man who always believed he could buy everything, finally began to build something money could never give, a story with his own son. So, what did you think of this journey? On a scale of 0 to 10, what score would you give to the end of Richard's transformation? Leave your comment and subscribe for our next exciting stories. Thank you for your company, and see you next time.